The PAUSD 21-Day Challenge, My Daily Reflections by Jed Bloom, Green Middle School teacher. Day 1, Moving Away from Diversity Toward Equity. In today's reading, Ben Hecht writes, to build a new, more inclusive culture, we first needed to be able to see the norms, values, and practices in our institutions that advantage white people and ways of working, to the exclusion and oppression of all others. This is the first crucial step toward equity that must not be overlooked. As Ms. Conaway pointed out in her post, acknowledgement that there is something inherently wrong in our society and in our system is the first step. Not enough of us are there yet. I resonated deeply with this quote because I have seen in myself and other white people a desire to solve racial inequity without doing a proper self-diagnosis of our implicit biases, our white privilege, and our collective complicity in racially unjust systems, starting in our own homes, neighborhoods, centers of worship, and places of employment. Day 2. Being nice is not going to end racism. The statement that struck me the hardest from Robin DiAngelo's video is when she said, quote, "Everything in the outside world will try to compel you not to see this anymore." She goes on to assert that if white people don't create structures in our lives, and if we don't have a disciplined and sustained approach to addressing our unconscious embrace of white supremacy, then we will succeed in upholding the status quo. Her call to a lifelong, humble pursuit of anti-racism is one I hope to answer faithfully. Day 3. Megan Ming Francis, Let's Get to the Root of Racial Injustice. In her powerful speech, Megan Ming Francis states, "In talking about the current racial crisis, we tend to focus all our attention on police and overlook our own complicity in creating an environment in which black lives are not treated as equal. This blame-shifting phenomenon is a means by which we get to excuse ourselves from the problem by scapegoating a different party than us, in this case, the police. I'm receiving the same message over and over from virtually every source in this challenge. As a white person, I must look inward. As white people, we must look inward. How are we complicit? Are we willing to acknowledge, as Francis exhorts us to, that we have equated blackness with criminality and continue to do so? Are we as white people willing to acknowledge that we have a collective racialized mindset that views black people as threatening, which has directly led to the racial disparities we see among the incarcerated? Am I willing to admit that? If I strive to be an anti-racist, I must. Day 4. Stories. One of the most enriching aspects of the Equity Challenge thus far is reading and listening to people's stories. Our brains are hardwired for stories, as they are for bias, and I've been so impacted by them. Megan Ming Francis' brother being frisked by police while sitting on a stoop, Francis' own dehumanizing experience with a TSA agent, Jennifer L. Eberhardt's account of her son not knowing why he was equating blackness with criminality at the tender age of 5, Ben Hecht's sober realization that his company was racially diverse but not racially inclusive. To make gains in the movement toward racial equity, we need personal stories as much as we need statistics and knowledge. We need to be touched on a human level. I'm so thankful that this challenge is providing that for me. Day 5. Trivializing microaggressions. What's frustrating about the topic of microaggressions is that, due to their subtle nature, white people are more willing to dismiss the concept as overblown or even made up. This is evident from the Unmasking Racial Microaggressions article, in which even some professors claim that drawing attention to microaggressions is divisive and destructive. But it's clear from story after story that people of color are deeply hurt, disoriented, and demoralized by the microaggressions they consistently receive. I'm left feeling that this is just another case of marginalized groups saying, "This is real, this is happening to me, this is how I feel when that happens," and white people responding with indifference. The tendency of white people to trivialize marginalized people's pain is just one cog in the elaborate machine of white supremacy. Day 6. Joe Truss article. Like many, I respect Joe Truss a great deal. I've attended his Dismantling White Supremacy Culture workshops and have experienced his wise leadership. And as Joe describes the anti-racist culture he's co-labored to establish at the school he leads, I can't help but feel a little wistful. I long for the shared understanding at my school that we all participate in white supremacy culture, and for us to each arrive at the acknowledgement that, quote, I want to be an anti-racist educator, but I don't exactly know how, as Truss states his colleagues all did, each taking a different path of identifying white supremacy culture's influence externally and in their own lives. I long to work at a school that shares this common anti-racist purpose, but like Mr. Truss states, first, white fragility must be debriefed and defined amongst staff members, or else it will reign unchecked and cripple any anti-racist effort. Day 7. Fear and Fragility. As a black man, Professor Paul Butler says having to perform for people, for example, a white woman in an elevator, to prove he's not a threat to them, feels like apologizing for your existence. Putting his head down to quell white people's fear is like saying, please excuse poor black me. Dr. Ibram Kendi explores the racial terror he experiences when white people fear him, when they assume the worst of him. Tyler Merritt's powerful 3-minute monologue is a basic plea to view him as human, something black people have been trying to convince white people of since the beginning of our shared history. But as Robin DiAngelo communicates in her video, ignoring these impassioned appeals with defensiveness insulates white people from having to acknowledge their own racism, which in turn upholds the racial status quo. Day 8. Love. I appreciate Trustee DeBrienne's exhortation today that it takes 3 weeks for habits to form. Hopefully, she said, we can form racial equity habits by the end of the challenge. I'm trying to think what a racial equity habit means for me as a white man. I think it means allowing face after face, story after story, to wash over me so many times that I can't help but feel some of the pain. And when I feel enough pain to where it takes root in me, I can start to feel love. Some of that true, costly, repentant love. Some of that we are all God's image bearers kind of love. Day 9. From A Conversation with White People About Race. I was moved by the Asian Americans on race conversation as well as the Latinos on race conversation. The individual voices woven together to form a collective statement had a profound effect. But one woman's remarks from the white conversation really resonated with me. She said, I really did not know that I had a racial identity. I knew I was white, but had no idea what that meant, how that had shaped my outlook on life, how that had shaped my sense of optimism, my sense of belonging, sense of safety, my sense of feeling entitled to go help children that I thought were part of a community that couldn't figure out how to help themselves. I hear my own journey in this woman's honest words, eyes opening to the privilege, pride melting into a puddle beneath my feet. Will it stay shedded? Crying at the condescension I've exhibited toward communities of color and clawing to find my way out of the foolishness. Day 10. The Violent Truth. Are we going to pretend like history didn't happen? Are we going to roll our eyes every time people make sports analogies to black folks starting off in the 8th inning down by 10 runs? Are we going to ignore that white people violently enslaved black people, violently codified segregation, violently prevented blacks from building wealth through home ownership? Yes, violently. Read The Color of Law. Targeted black communities for subprime loans, slithering into their churches to make a sales pitch, and then treat reparations as an intellectual exercise? Like, oh, maybe so. I'm not sure, though. Let's talk more about it. Let's table this for now. No justice, no peace. Day 11. Hayden Crystal's presentation. Impactful lines from Hayden Crystal's talk included, it's really, really difficult to admit that you might be causing the same kind of pain that somebody else has caused you. That line just sank in me. Also, bigotry is applied ignorance. And finally, you can't change what you don't acknowledge. Hayden Crystal spoke from their lived experience at the intersection of transgender and deaf discrimination, and I am deeply grateful for their story and wisdom. I feel very uncomfortable from viewing these videos on intersectionality today, and I am thankful because someone once told me that our only hope is to be unsettled. Why didn't I know those black women's names who were killed by police? From The Urgency of Intersectionality. Why do I think of white people when disabled people are mentioned? From The Triple Cripples. What kind of bigotry or applied ignorance do I exhibit toward people with disabilities and toward the transgender community? From Hayden Crystal's speech. To add to the implicit racial bias that I demonstrate daily. Day 12. Environmental Justice. I took the Equity Challenge leadership suggestion to pace myself throughout the challenge, and I've been doing that. I've tried to cap my source intake to 15 to 20 minutes a day, but I just got sucked in today. I read and watched everything because I couldn't take my eyes away from this massive issue and all its complexity, all the sinister ways in which people of color have come to be disproportionately impacted by climate change and the improper stewardship of our planet. Marine biologist Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson quotes Toni Morrison as saying, "The most impactful aspect of racism is that it's a distraction. Addressing racism is so utterly time-consuming," Johnson adds. "Individual dreams are abandoned to dress the wounds that racism has inflicted on one's community. Trudging through racial fatigue requires energy that could otherwise be used for unlimited achievements. But this has sparked in her a greater urgency to communicate the marriage of climate change and racial injustice." In other news, oil drilling sites and waste management sites are set up in communities of color, far away from white people. More racism. I'll close with Kendi's words from How to Be an Anti-Racist because it captures what I'm feeling. Quote, "There is nothing I see in our world today, in our history, giving me hope that one day anti-racists will win the fight. But once we lose hope, we are guaranteed to lose." Day 13. When every word doesn't belong to everyone. Ta-Nehisi Coates' talk was amazing. His breakdown of black people using derogatory terms, ironically, was illustrative and eye-opening. The most important part was when he pointed out why white people feel so angered that they're excluded from using the same language black people do. In the U.S., he explains, white people walk around like everything belongs to them, so to not have access to this one word feels like oppression. But when Coates provides example after example of situations in which it's okay for one group of people to address each other in a certain way but others can't, for example, his wife calls him honey, wouldn't be okay for another woman to do that, or his grandma and aunts call his dad Billy, but he could never do that as a boy, it becomes obvious that white people are especially caught up and fixated on affording black people no grace or understanding when it comes to in-group speech. Day 14. Feeling a little sick. Richard Rothstein's Segregation by Design video, based on his book The Color of Law, left me feeling a little sick. The premise is clear. What our federal, state, and local governments did to African Americans through 20th century housing policy is blatantly unconstitutional. Our government has an obligation to uphold the 5th, 13th, and 14th Amendments, which swear to treat citizens equally and to rid our country of any form of second-class citizenship. The government broke this oath by deliberately creating separate and unequal neighborhoods, by displacing thousands of black families, and by preventing wealth accrual for black families through prohibitive lending policies. Our federal government, through the Federal Housing Authority, refused to insure loans to black families and strictly forbade them from moving into newly created white suburbs. When black families did manage to secure housing in white neighborhoods, they were met with state-sanctioned mob violence. All of this is despicable and maddening, and there are many more examples of this kind of de jure segregation. Rothstein argues the only way to start to remedy the problem, as is our constitutional obligation, is for all of us, federal, state, and local leaders, as well as every white person who benefits from white supremacy, to accept responsibility. After watching this, will we? And if not, what will it take? Day 15. Aisha Thomas. Quote, "I believe representation is vital because it provides the opportunity for your existence to be acknowledged in this world." Aisha Thomas's story, as well as the Vice Media article, spoke to the need for positive and uplifting representation of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, in all spaces of society, movies, novels, leadership, and every profession. There is measurable psychological damage inflicted upon children of color when they don't have positive leaders in which to see themselves reflected. These include classroom teachers, history books, government officials, professors, engineers, doctors, and so on. The lack of diverse representation also damages white people. Growing up in an all-white neighborhood, my only exposure to black people was through the media. When I recently took the implicit bias test, I didn't need to find out the score at the end to know how I would fare, because the black faces I was shown in the test were just like the faces I watched getting smashed onto the side of police vehicles in the show Cops, robbing stores at gunpoint in the movie Menace to Society, and performing drive-by shootings in the film Boys in the Hood. For me, these portrayals solidified blackness as something to be feared, and I will spend the rest of my life actively unlearning the racialized mindset they helped to form in me. Day 16. Nita Mosby Tyler and Allyship. I was both encouraged and stirred by Nita Mosby Tyler, but I have to confess, I was left feeling a little cynical. There's a reason white people aren't leading the charge to end racism. They don't face it every day, and so it becomes easy to forget about. Racism inevitably becomes a back burner issue until they come into direct contact with it through powerful stories of BIPOC or horrendous displays of racism. In stating this, I do not mean to diminish the crucial role of white allyship, but this is the truth. White people face a daily choice between the uncomfortable, power-shedding pursuit of racial justice or the warm, familiar waters of white supremacy. I have a choice to surrender my fight against racism at any time for the rest of my life if it gets too hard. It might be so gradual that I don't even notice. Black, indigenous people of color do not have that choice. Day 17. The Hill We Climb. Thank you, Ms. Conaway, for your words. You are steering us all through this challenge with wisdom and compassion. It is an honor to call you my Superintendent of Equity and Student Affairs. It is heartening to see how many people post lines and phrases from the sources each day, words that really impact them. Like others, I have listened to Amanda Gorman's poem several times and hear something new each time. This time it was, quote, "Even as we grieved, we grew. Even as we hurt, we hoped." That's just hitting different at a time like this. I'm trying to hold on to these words as I go forward, as we go forward. Day 18, at Y Conaway and at Talk Account. Thank you, Ms. Conaway, again for an insightful and strong response to another person's comment. I will simply echo Ms. Conaway's line. Today, the barriers exist and are only seen if we allow ourselves to see them. This is profound. This 21-day equity challenge has been carefully and powerfully curated to reveal systemic racism against Black people for our entire history as a nation. The challenge has broken down with love and precision and repetition all the ways that Black people have been systematically oppressed, often violently, in every aspect of society. This has been laid bare through powerful writing, personal storytelling, and research, conveyed every day in this challenge. If you don't see this, it's because you choose not to see it. Day 19, Losing Hope. Priya Vulchi and Winona Guo's TED Talk was thorough and inspiring. The recent high school graduates wrote a book on racial literacy, combining statistics with personal stories. They're doing something, and I'm inspired. Janet Stovall's talk on diversity and inclusion in the workplace is equally powerful. She's right. If businesses were as singularly focused on eradicating racism as they were about their short-term bottom line, they could produce dramatic racial progress in a short amount of time. Likewise, Janice Gassam Asare has good ideas that, if followed, would also make a big difference. But alas, I'm losing hope. All of these great ideas don't mean anything if we don't agree to respond to them. And I'm discerning more that our dominant culture society, both at large and locally, has what Vulchi and Guo call a heart gap and a mind gap. Quote, the heart gap, an inability to understand each of our experiences, to fiercely and unapologetically be compassionate beyond lip service. And second, the mind gap, an inability to understand the larger systemic ways in which racism operates, unquote. I'm losing hope because I see this mind and heart gap manifest even in the comments of this Padlet, and I'm just too tired to try and justify myself right now, nor should I feel the need to explain how I see it. But it's there, and I'm drained. I'm feeling done. Day 20. Speaking up as a spiritual practice, detached from what the results may be. Brittany Wong states that we should speak up against white solidarity for our own sake, not so much as a means of educating others. It strengthens our spiritual backbone to speak out against coded language and to disrupt white centrality. Conversely, it weakens our moral fabric when we let that opportunity pass by. I felt stretched by Lovey Ajayi-Jones' 3 questions to ask before speaking up about the hard stuff. She asks, do I mean it? Can I defend it? And can I say it with love? The last one is problematic because it leads to tone policing, as elaborated upon in the book White Fragility. Basically, if what you say when calling out racism isn't said with the utmost politeness and kindness, then the recipient has every right to reject it. This is a means by which white people can discredit any message they deem to be rude or aggressive or accusatory. That's why the statement is true, that, quote, kindness is not the antidote to injustice, unquote. So, I'm resolute. I will let my love shine with the hard truth, no matter how it's received. Day 21. Thank you. I would like to thank Miss Lana Conaway, Miss Courtney Carlomagno, Miss Chantal Gaines, Miss Emily Garrison, Miss Diana Chen, Miss Sarah Patanroy, and everyone else who helped make this equity challenge a success. I know there are many of you. The learning experience was amazing. The resources were incredible. All the speakers at Thursday Night Live were truthful, insightful, bold, and heart-provoking. The website was so seamless, and the visuals were beautiful. The whole event was masterfully curated and directed. We have been given an education. But as Ibram Kendi says in a video, it is not enough to be aware. Awareness of racism is always the first step, but there are many steps that follow as we march toward the promised land of racial justice and equity for all. My next steps? Continuing to sit at the feet of Black and Indigenous people of color and listening, acknowledging my defensiveness when it pops up and renouncing it, supporting Black businesses, researching a move of my money to Black-owned banks, as the article suggests, pursuing culturally responsive pedagogy with reckless abandon, and advocating for district-wide training in this area.